world where bearing daughters is considered a curse, one woman's suffering becomes the spark that ignites a kingdom's darkest secrets. Beaten, disgraced, and cast into the mud by her own village, she clutches her three small girls as the crowd's hatred rains down upon them. But when a solitary prince, whose heart has been locked away behind castle walls, extends his hand and utters four words that will change everything. "You come with me," no one could predict the ancient truths about to surface. As royal birthmarks are revealed and whispers of scandal spread through the court like wildfire, the question isn't just who these children are, but what powerful forces would kill to keep their existence a secret forever. The silence of the village was broken only by the desperate weeping of a peasant woman fallen in the mud, her face marked with bruises and her clothes torn by the contempt of her own people. Beside her, three small girls sobbed in fear, pressing themselves against their mother's body. The morning sun cast long shadows across the village square, illuminating the scene like a cruel painting. A mother, broken and bleeding, with three daughters clinging to her like fragile vines to a crumbling wall. "Curse upon you!" shouted a villager as he passed, spitting on the ground beside them. The glob of saliva landed inches from the youngest girl's bare feet, causing her to whimper and hide her face in her mother's tattered skirt. For them, bringing three daughters into the world was a shame, a sign of weakness. In these harsh lands, where every hand was needed for labor, where survival hung by a thread as thin as hope, sons were treasure and daughters were burden. And three daughters. That was beyond forgiveness. The woman, Alara, kept her head bowed, not from submission, but to hide the fire that still burned in her eyes. She could endure their blows, their cruel words, but the way they looked at her children, as if they were less than human, that cut deeper than any village man's fist ever could. Her swollen lip throbbed with each breath, and the taste of iron filled her mouth. Yet it was not her own pain that brought tears streaming down her dirt-streaked face, but the knowledge that her daughters would inherit a world that despised them simply for being born. The crowd had gathered since dawn, drawn like vultures to the scent of misfortune. Their faces, weathered by hardship and narrowed by prejudice, formed a wall of judgment around the huddled family. Some women whispered behind calloused hands, their eyes darting between Alara and their own husbands with unspoken fears. The men stood with arms crossed, their contempt barely contained behind clenched jaws and cold stares. "No man wants a wife who gives only girls," hissed an old woman, her voice like dry leaves rustling in autumn wind. "3 times she's failed. 3 times. "The gods have judged her," nodded another, crossing himself hurriedly. "There must be darkness in her soul." Alara pulled her daughters closer, creating a fragile fortress of flesh and bone around them. The eldest, barely 7 summers old, glared back at the villagers with a defiance that mirrored her mother's hidden fire. The middle child, with eyes too wise for her 5 years, counted the pebbles at her feet, retreating into the small world she could control. And the youngest, not yet 3, simply clung to her mother's neck, too young to understand why the village that had watched her take her first steps now looked at her as if she were a plague. It was then that firm footsteps echoed behind the crowd. The sea of peasants parted reluctantly, revealing a figure whose presence seemed to command the very air around him. The prince, tall and severe, emerged between the villagers, his heavy cloak dragging in the mud and his cold gaze silencing the murmurs. His unexpected appearance in this remote village had already caused a stir since morning, but now, as he approached the center of this human storm, even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The prince's heart, so often imprisoned behind stone walls, both literal and figurative, trembled at the sight of this woman with wet eyes that somehow still held a silent dignity. His own solitude, the weight of expectations and duty that had been his only companions for years, recognized something in her, a strength that went beyond physical power, a nobility that needed no crown. No one dared to extend a hand to her, but he did. "You come with me," he said in a firm voice, offering his arm. The gesture ignited the square in rumors and scandalized glances. The villagers stepped back as if the prince had suddenly burst into flames, their expressions caught between shock and a terrible, hungry curiosity. Alara hesitated, her eyes widening with fear and confusion. Was this another form of punishment? A public humiliation orchestrated by the local lord? Her arms tightened around her daughters as if she could somehow make them invisible. The prince's face remained unreadable, but there was something in his eyes. Not kindness exactly, but recognition, as if he were looking at her and seeing someone else entirely. While the peasant woman wavered, one of the girls, the middle one with the knowing eyes, let her arm escape from her mother's protective embrace, revealing a strange birthmark in the shape of a half-moon on her wrist. The mark was dark against her pale skin, unmistakable in its perfect crescent shape, exactly identical to the one on the prince's own wrist, usually hidden beneath royal cuffs and carefully arranged sleeves. The world seemed to stop. The prince's gaze hardened as it fixed on that small wrist, and the advisors accompanying him exchanged alarmed looks. The eldest advisor, a man whose white beard could not hide the sharp calculation in his eyes, stepped forward and whispered something urgent in the prince's ear. But the royal heir seemed not to hear, transfixed by that impossible mirror of his own mark. Who, in fact, were these girls? How could a peasant child bear the sacred mark of the royal bloodline, a symbol that had appeared on only a select few throughout the kingdom's long history? The heavy silence of the square was broken by a cry. "Blasphemy!" It came from the village priest, a thin man whose authority rested more on fear than faith. He pointed a trembling finger at the child's wrist. "The sacred mark cannot be worn by common blood. This is witchcraft or worse." The crowd, uncertain before, now found direction for their malice. Whispers of witch and demon rippled through their ranks. Someone grabbed a stone, and the mothers pulled their own children back, as if Alara's daughters might contaminate them with some mysterious evil. But before the first stone could fly, the prince's voice cut through the growing chaos like a blade through silk. "Enough." Just one word, spoken quietly, yet it carried the weight of generations of command. I said, "You come with me." This time it was not an offer, but an order. And with that single decision, made in a muddy village square under a sky heavy with approaching rain, the fate of all would change from this moment forward. For some secrets, once glimpsed, cannot be unseen. Some truths, once whispered, cannot be silenced. And some meetings, seemingly by chance, are written in stars older than the kingdom itself. Ilara rose slowly, gathering her dignity around her like a cloak more royal than any the prince wore. With one daughter in her arms and two clinging to her skirts, she took a step toward him, toward an unknown future that somehow could not be worse than the present she was leaving behind. And the prince, whose solitude had been his only constant companion, found himself suddenly responsible for 4 lives that would either be his salvation or his downfall. The peasant woman was led to the castle, surrounded by contemptuous glances from the ladies and venomous whispers from the servants. Every step she took echoed against the stone floors, announcing her presence, unwanted, uninvited, to all who dwelled within these ancient walls. Ilara kept her eyes lowered, not out of deference but necessity. If she looked up, if she allowed herself to see the hatred and disgust in their eyes, she might lose what little courage remained in her battered heart. Her 3 daughters huddled close, like frightened deer sensing predators. The eldest tried to mirror her mother's dignity, chin raised despite her trembling lower lip. The middle child's eyes darted everywhere, cataloging exits and dangers with unnerving awareness. The youngest simply clung to her mother's skirts, thumb firmly planted in her mouth, too overwhelmed to even cry anymore. The prince, however, remained steadfast, as if he had seen something in that woman that no one else could perceive. With each step deeper into the castle, he stood taller, his royal authority a shield against the silent judgment that pressed in from all sides. Lords and ladies who had spent their lives currying favor now averted their gaze, whispering behind jeweled hands about the scandal walking in their midst. A peasant? In the royal quarters? And those children, so dirty, so common. What bewitchment has fallen upon our prince? The whispers followed them like shadows, but the prince's face betrayed nothing. Only the slight tightening of his jaw revealed that he heard every word, felt every stare. For a man who had spent his life performing the perfect dance of court politics, this deliberate misstep was more than shocking. It was incomprehensible. With each step inside those cold walls, Ilara felt herself being swallowed by a world to which she had never belonged. The vastness of the great hall made her village home seem like a child's toy. Tapestries taller than trees depicted battles she had never heard of, won by kings whose names were mere legends to her people. Servants in finer clothes than she had ever owned scurried past, their eyes either boldly curious or carefully blank. But there was something more, an ancient fear, locked away under 7 keys in her heart. A fear that had nothing to do with the opulence surrounding her and everything to do with what these walls represented. Power unchecked, appetites unrestrained, consequences that never reached the powerful. She had learned that lesson in blood and tears, and the scars, though invisible, ached with renewed purpose. Night fell like a curtain, bringing with it the uncertainty of darkness. The prince had instructed servants to prepare a small chamber adjacent to the servants' quarters, not luxurious by castle standards, but more comfort than Ilara had ever known. Fresh straw had been laid for beds, and for the first time in months, they would sleep without fear of rain finding its way through a leaking roof. The 3 girls fell asleep almost immediately, their small bodies curled together like kittens seeking warmth. Their faces, scrubbed clean by castle servants who handled them with reluctant duty, looked younger in sleep, unburdened by the weight of a world that had already taught them to expect cruelty. Alone with her thoughts at last, while her daughters dreamed on improvised bedding, the woman could not contain her tears. They came silently, years of practice ensuring that her sobs made no sound. Her shoulders shook with the effort of containing a grief too vast for her body to hold. The prince's hand touched her shoulder in silence, his approach so quiet she hadn't heard him enter. Ilara startled, instinctively moving to shield her sleeping children. But there was no threat in his posture, only an awkward attempt at comfort that spoke of a man unused to offering solace. She felt the strange mixture of consolation and danger in that simple touch. His hand was smooth, unmarked by labor, yet there was strength there, and power that could crush her with a word. The same power that had once— "Why did you bring us here?" she whispered, her voice barely audible even in the quiet room. "What do you want from us?" The prince's eyes, in the flickering candlelight, revealed nothing. "The mark on your child's wrist. I need to understand." Something in his tone, not demand but something closer to pleading, loosened the knot of fear in Ilara's chest. And then, in a suffocated whisper, she revealed what she had always hidden. The children were not the daughters of a peasant man, but the fruit of violence committed by a powerful man, someone whom no one dared to face. "It was summer solstice 5 years past," she began, each word dragged from her throat like a splinter from flesh. "I was summoned to serve wine at the manor house. The lord had guests from the capital." Her eyes fixed on a point beyond the prince's shoulder, seeing not the present but that night carved into her memory. "There was one among them who watched me, all evening, just watched. I thought nothing of it. Lords always look at serving women as if we're less than human." She paused, fingers twisting the rough fabric of her skirt. "When the festivities ended, I was sent to clear chambers in the east wing. He was waiting there." Her voice faltered. "He said I had been chosen for an honor, that I should be grateful." The prince's face had gone pale, a terrible understanding dawning in his eyes. He wore fine clothes, spoke with education. His signet ring caught the light when he— She stopped, unable to continue. 9 months later, my eldest was born. He returned twice more in the following years. Each time I gave birth to another daughter." She looked up finally, meeting the prince's gaze with unexpected fierceness. "My husband cast me out when the 3rd was born. Said no man fathers only daughters, that I must have lain with demons. The village believed him." The prince recoiled as if he had been struck by an invisible sword. His gaze traveled again to the marks on the girl's wrists, remembering ancient stories of his own family. The half-moon birthmark that appeared only in those of direct royal lineage, passed down through generations as a sign of divine right to rule. "This cannot be true," he murmured, trying to convince himself. His mind raced through possibilities, each more disturbing than the last. The royal signet ring she described, the timing of the visits. the unmistakable mark that could not be coincidence. But deep down, he already knew. These children carried in their blood the most dangerous scandal in the kingdom. They were not merely victims of violence. They were living proof of royal transgression, their very existence a threat to the carefully maintained lies that kept the kingdom stable. If what the peasant woman said was true, and the birthmark left little room for doubt, then these 3 small girls sleeping on borrowed straw were more than orphans deserving charity. They were heirs to blood and power that would make them either treasured or targeted, depending on who discovered the truth first. The weight of this revelation pressed down on the prince like a physical force. The simplicity of his initial impulse to rescue a beaten woman and her children from cruelty had vanished, replaced by complications that threatened everything he knew: his family, his future, the very stability of the realm. Yet looking at the sleeping children, their faces peaceful in the ignorance of their own significance, he could not bring himself to regret his decision. Some truths, once glimpsed, demanded acknowledgement, no matter the cost. "Tomorrow," he said finally, his voice steady despite the turmoil within, "we will speak more of this. For tonight, rest without fear. You are under my protection now." What he did not say, what he dared not even think too loudly, was how fragile that protection might prove to be, once the full truth emerged from the shadows. Soon, rumors ran through the castle corridors like wildfire through dry straw. The whispers started in the kitchens, where servants first spotted Ilara and her daughters being escorted to their quarters. By dawn, the gossip had reached the guards' barracks, and by midday, it had infected the entire court like a plague of wagging tongues. The ladies of the court concealed their mockery behind ornate fans, their painted lips forming perfect O's of scandalized delight as they exchanged theories. "Have you seen how he looks at her?" one whispered, her voice honey-sweet with venom. "Perhaps our solemn prince has finally found use for his bed beyond sleeping." Their tittering laughter echoed off stone walls that had witnessed centuries of similar intrigues. The knights were less subtle in their disgust. In the training yard, they spoke openly of the shame brought upon the castle. "A common wench and her brats," spat a young knight, polishing his sword with aggressive strokes. "Next we'll be dining with pigs and sleeping in stables." His companions laughed, though one older knight frowned, his weathered face thoughtful beneath his graying hair. Even the castle's priests weren't immune to the gossip. They huddled in shadowy corners of the chapel, muttering prayers in low voices while casting suspicious glances at anyone who passed. "The prince has always been peculiar," one thin-faced cleric whispered, "but this suggests a weakness of character that bears watching." His companion nodded sagely, adding, "Perhaps we should recommend more frequent confession." The presence of the peasant woman and her daughters had become a scandal beyond measure. In a court where appearances were currency and reputation was power, the prince's decision was not merely unusual, it was potentially dangerous. Every noble family with a daughter of marriageable age watched with alarm as their carefully cultivated plans seemed threatened by a mud-splattered peasant with suspicious children. But more than disdain, more than shock, curiosity drove the whispers. Are they bastards? Whose? The question slithered through conversations at dinner, during prayers, in council meetings. Each word was a dagger aimed at the prince's honor, and by extension, at the stability of the realm itself. Ilara felt the weight of those stares, the burn of those whispers. She kept her daughters close, teaching them in hushed tones how to become invisible. "Walk near the walls," she instructed, demonstrating how to move silently. "Keep your eyes down but your ears open. Never answer unless directly addressed." Lessons of survival she had learned in a village were now adapted for the viper's nest of court politics. The eldest daughter, fierce and protective, positioned herself between her sisters and any approaching stranger. The middle child, observant beyond her years, memorized the castle's layout, finding hidden passages and quiet corners where they could escape prying eyes. The youngest simply held tight to her mother's hand, her wide eyes recording everything without comprehension. At first, the castle servants treated them with undisguised contempt. Chambermaids forgot to bring fresh water. Kitchen boys delivered cold meals. Guards stared through them as if they were ghosts. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, something began to change. A scullery maid slipped an extra apple to the youngest girl. An elderly gardener showed the middle child where spring flowers grew in a forgotten courtyard. A gruff weapons master nodded approvingly when the eldest stood her ground against a noble boy's taunts. "They ain't what I expected," admitted a sturdy cook to her assistant, watching the three girls help their mother fold linens. "Got manners, they do. Better'n some of the noble brats born with silver spoons choking for their mouths." In the grand banquet hall, during an evening feast that marked a minor saint's day, the atmosphere crackled with tension. The Queen Mother, a woman whose beauty had hardened into severe elegance with age, rose from her seat at the high table. Her movement, deliberate and graceful, silenced the hall more effectively than any shout could have. All eyes turned to her, anticipation thick in the air. "My son," she began, her voice carrying effortlessly across the vast space, "brings within our walls the fruit of shame." The hall froze. Courtiers held their breath. Servants paused mid-step. Even the flames in the great hearth seemed to still, as if nature itself awaited the outcome of this confrontation. The prince, seated at his mother's right hand, did not rise. His face remained impassive, a skill learned through years of court politics. But those closest to him noticed the slight whitening of his knuckles as he gripped his goblet. "Shame is closing our eyes to the truth," he responded, his voice low but firm. The words, though quietly spoken, carried in the silence. A pebble dropped into still water, creating ripples that would eventually reach every corner of the kingdom. The Queen Mother's face betrayed nothing, but the slight narrowing of her eyes spoke volumes to those who knew how to read the language of court displeasure. For a moment it seemed the confrontation would escalate, that lines would be drawn and sides chosen in a conflict that could tear the court apart. Then, with practiced grace, a court musician struck a chord on his lute. A nobleman knocked over his wine goblet with theatrical clumsiness. Conversations resumed with forced laughter and overloud discussions of hunting prospects and weather predictions. The moment of crisis passed, submerged beneath the current of courtly pretense but not forgotten, merely postponed. That night, in the privacy of his chambers, the prince paced restlessly. The smooth stone floor, worn by generations of royal feet, offered no answers to the questions plaguing him. The simplicity of his initial compassion had evolved into something far more complex and dangerous. He had known there would be opposition, but the vehemence, the immediate formation of factions, these suggested fears deeper than mere scandal. As he turned to pour himself wine from a silver decanter, he noticed a small piece of parchment that had not been there before. Slipped beneath his chamber door while he dined, its presence spoke of someone with access and audacity, a concerning combination. With a sense of foreboding, he unfolded the note. The handwriting was deliberately disguised, the letters formed with calculated imprecision to hide the writer's identity. In hasty strokes it read, "The marks do not lie. You know whose they are." The parchment fell from his hands, landing soundlessly on the thick carpet beneath his feet. The echo of that phrase seemed to reverberate through his soul, confirming fears he had been unwilling to fully acknowledge. The birthmark on the children's wrists, the half-moon shape that matched his own, was no coincidence. It was a signature, a brand of lineage that could not be denied or disguised. And if he knew, as the note suggested, whose blood those children carried. He crossed to the window, pushing aside heavy velvet curtains to stare out at the moonlit courtyard below. The castle slumbered, or pretended to, but he knew that behind dozens of doors, plots were being woven, alliances formed, strategies devised, all because he had brought 4 insignificant lives within these walls, or perhaps not so insignificant after all. If what he suspected was true, if the father of those 3 girls was who he feared, then their very existence was not merely scandal, but potential treason. Their blood made them either victims to be pitied or threats to be eliminated, depending on who controlled the narrative. The castle, which had been his prison and his protection for all his life, suddenly seemed full of shadows deeper than the night outside. Behind every tapestry could lurk an enemy, within every pleasant conversation might hide a trap. The note writer could be friend or foe, there was no way to know. The prince closed his eyes, feeling the weight of his decision pressing down upon him. He had acted on impulse, on compassion, on a strange sense of recognition when he saw that half-moon mark. Now he must act with calculation, with foresight, with the cunning that his position demanded. For in the game of power that surrounded the throne, there were no innocent moves, and those who played with honor often lost more than the game. The prince began discreetly investigating the peasant woman's origins. The task required delicacy. Too many direct questions would alert those already watching his every move with suspicion. Instead, he dispatched his most trusted servant, an aging man who had served him since childhood, to make inquiries in the village under the guise of collecting taxes. "Learn everything you can about the woman Ilara," he instructed, his voice low though they were alone in his private chamber. "Her family, her marriage, her past. Leave no stone unturned, but do so with subtlety." The servant bowed, his rheumy eyes sharp with understanding. "And the children, my lord?" "Especially the children," the prince confirmed, turning to gaze out the window where, in the courtyard below, the three girls were cautiously exploring their new surroundings, staying close to the shadows as their mother had taught them. The investigation yielded troubling revelations. Ilara had lived in silent shame after being summoned to serve a prominent noble on a night when the village celebrated the harvest festival. The lord's hunting party had stopped in the village, demanding accommodations and entertainment. She had been selected, honored, the village elder had called it, to serve wine to the distinguished guests. What happened after the feasting ended, she told no one. She returned to her cottage before dawn, her clothing torn, her eyes hollow. Her husband, a simple farmer with calloused hands and a kind heart, noticed the change in her but asked no questions. When her belly swelled with child, he accepted the baby as his own. It was only after the third daughter was born, each bearing the same crescent birthmark, that whispers began. Whispers that became accusations. Whispers that turned her husband's kindness to suspicion, then to rage. "No man fathers only daughters," the village said, "and no common man's children bear marks of the moon on their skin." "She never spoke a word about that night," reported the servant upon his return. "Not even when they beat her in the village square. Not even when her husband cast her out. Not even when they called her children demons. She remained silent, my lord, out of fear. Fear of dying from shame and starvation." The prince paced his chamber, connecting pieces of a puzzle he was beginning to wish he'd never encountered. "And the timing of these visits? You're certain?" "Yes, my lord. The eldest girl is 7 years of age, born 9 months after the royal hunting party passed through the region. The others followed at 2-year intervals, each birth preceded by a visit from noble travelers requiring accommodation in the village. The pattern was undeniable. The timing matched perfectly with the royal hunting expeditions led by the king's older brother, the prince's uncle, who had mysteriously vanished 5 years ago during a border skirmish. His body was never found, but blood-soaked garments and his broken sword were recovered, enough evidence to declare him fallen in battle. A hero's death for a man whose heroism existed only in carefully crafted tales told at court. Meanwhile, the three girls were slowly, cautiously adapting to castle life. Despite Ilara's efforts to keep them hidden and quiet, children have a way of slipping into spaces adults overlook, of finding warmth in the coldest environments. The eldest daughter, Lyra, had her mother's fierce protectiveness and a dignity beyond her years. She watched the noble children during their lessons, hiding behind columns in the great hall, absorbing their manners and speech. At night, she would practice the elegant gestures and formal phrases, determined that no one would ever again have cause to look down on her or her sisters. The middle child, Mira, was the quiet observer. Where others saw stone walls, she discovered hidden passages and forgotten stairwells. She mapped the castle in her mind, creating escape routes and hiding places. Her eyes missed nothing. Not the secret glances between courtiers, not the pattern of guard rotations, not the way certain servants listened at doors when they thought no one was watching. And the youngest, Kira, barely 3 years old, had an uncanny ability to charm even the most hardened hearts. Her innocent questions and solemn gaze often disarmed those who approached with contempt. "Why is your face angry?" she would ask a scowling noble, tilting her head with genuine curiosity. Or she would offer a wildflower, plucked from the castle garden, to a servant who had been cruel the day before. Small kindnesses began to accumulate around the girls like snowflakes, building slowly into something that could almost be called acceptance. The ancient kennel master allowed Lyra to help feed the hunting hounds. The head librarian, catching Mira reading a manuscript she had no business touching, sighed, and then showed her how to turn the pages without damaging the parchment. A young guardsman, finding Kira lost in a corridor, knelt to her level and escorted her back to her mother, his fierce expression softening as she slipped her tiny hand trustingly into his. "They're more real than many nobles here," confessed a guard in a low voice to his companion during a night watch, hiding a smile as he remembered how Lyra had solemnly corrected his grip on his spear. "That eldest one, she's got the prince's bearing, I swear it. Stands like royalty, she does, for all she's dressed in borrowed clothes." "Watch your tongue," his companion warned, glancing nervously at the shadows. "Walls have ears, and talk like that could cost more than your position." But each gesture of kindness, each moment of connection, only intensified the fury of those who saw the peasant family as a threat to the established order. The Queen Mother's ladies-in-waiting took special delight in accidentally spilling wine on Alara's clean laundry. Young nobles tripped the girls as they passed. Guards suddenly became blind when such incidents occurred, deaf to cries of pain or protest. And through it all, one name began to surface repeatedly in the prince's investigations. His uncle, the king's older brother, who had vanished under circumstances that, in retrospect, seemed increasingly convenient rather than tragic. Lord Alaric had been the heir apparent, next in line to the throne until his untimely death. Known for his hunting prowess and military skill, he was beloved by the common people for his charisma and by the nobles for his traditional values. Only those in the innermost circles of power knew his darker appetites, his cruelty disguised as discipline, his entitlement masked as divine right. The prince had been 15 when his uncle disappeared, old enough to observe but young enough to be kept from the full truth. He remembered the court's performative grief, the elaborate memorial, the songs commissioned to commemorate the fallen hero. But he also remembered his mother's face at the funeral, not grieving but vigilant, her eyes scanning the crowd as if searching for threats rather than sharing in collective sorrow. Now, as he pieced together fragments of the past, a disturbing picture emerged. The blood that flowed through those 3 innocent children might indeed be the key to a secret buried within the royal family itself. If his suspicions were correct, if Lord Alaric was the father of Alara's children, then the implications were staggering. The crescent birthmark was undeniable evidence of royal lineage, appearing only in those of direct descent from the kingdom's founding dynasty. That these village girls bore it meant they carried royal blood, blood that gave them a claim, however distant, to the very throne itself. No wonder the anonymous note had appeared under his door. No wonder his mother watched with such calculating eyes. No wonder certain factions at court were already maneuvering against his protégés. The blood of kings was never spilled without consequence, and the children who carried it were never truly safe, especially from those who already wore the crown. The pressure mounted with each passing day. What had begun as whispers evolved into open challenges as the prince's decision to harbor a peasant woman and her children threatened the delicate political balance of the court. The royal counselors, men whose families had advised the throne for generations, now gathered in the oak-paneled war room, their faces set in expressions of grave concern that barely masked their anger. "Your Highness," began Lord Merrick, the eldest among them, his white beard meticulously groomed to project wisdom and authority, "we must speak plainly about the situation you have created." He folded his hands on the polished table, the emerald signet ring on his finger catching the light from the tall windows. This woman must be removed from the castle. Her presence endangers alliances that took decades to forge. The other counselors nodded in unified agreement. Lord Bannon, whose daughter had long been considered a potential match for the prince, leaned forward with barely contained disdain. "The Eastland delegation arrives in a fortnight. How do you propose to explain the presence of a village woman in the royal quarters? The Princess Isolde expects a court of refinement and dignity, not a—" He paused, searching for a word both cutting and acceptable in royal company. Charity Ward for wayward peasants. She is just a peasant. The words erupted from Lord Kearney, the youngest of the council and the most impetuous. My prince, we have indulged this fascination of yours, but the time for games has passed. The kingdom requires your full attention. Trade negotiations with the southern realms, border disputes with Westmark, marriage alliances that will secure our future. These matters cannot wait while you play savior to some common wench and her brats. The prince listened without expression, a talent he had perfected over years of court politics. Only the slight tightening of his jaw betrayed any emotion at all. These men, with their ancient names and carefully calculated outrage, saw only the surface of his actions. None of them, not even those who suspected the truth about the children's birthmarks, understood what truly drove him. The woman and her daughters remain under my protection, he said finally, his voice quiet but carrying the unmistakable tone of royal command. This is not open for debate. The councillors exchanged glances, a silent conversation of raised eyebrows and pursed lips that communicated volumes of disapproval. They would retreat for now, but the prince knew this battle was far from over. As the meeting dispersed, he remained seated, staring at the maps spread across the table. Territories and borders that seemed suddenly less significant than the lives of 4 people who had stumbled into his world. Even the queen, in her private solar, where she received her son that evening, pleaded in her way for him to reconsider. She did not raise her voice, she never did, having learned long ago that power often spoke most effectively in whispers. "My son," she said, setting aside her embroidery, a complex pattern of golden threads on midnight blue silk. "You have always had a compassionate heart. It is one of your finest qualities." Her eyes, still sharp despite the fine lines that framed them, held his gaze with an intensity that belied her calm demeanor. But compassion without wisdom becomes folly, and folly in a prince can become tragedy for a kingdom. She rose, moving to the window that overlooked the inner courtyard. Below, servants hurried about their evening duties, lighting torches that cast long shadows across the cobblestones. "There are whispers, my son, dangerous whispers about those children and what their presence here might mean." The prince joined her at the window, noticing how the fading light silvered her once dark hair. "Mother, would you have me cast out innocent children to appease court gossip?" "No," she said softly, "but I would have you consider the consequences of your actions. The royal court is not a sanctuary. It is a battlefield where every kindness can become a weapon used against you." She touched his arm, a rare gesture of affection from a woman who had learned to guard her emotions as carefully as the royal treasury. "Whatever you believe about those children, whatever truth you seek to uncover, remember that others will have their own interpretations and their own ambitions." The warning was clear, delivered with the precision that characterized all the Queen's communications. The prince nodded, understanding that her concern was genuine, even if her solution differed from his own. He was indeed surrounded, caught between those who demanded the peasant family's removal and his own growing conviction that they deserved not just protection, but justice. Yet as he walked the corridors of the castle that night, a curious sensation began to replace the weight of isolation he had carried for so long. It came to him first as he passed the small chamber where Alara and her daughters had been quartered. The door was slightly ajar, and from within came the sound of laughter. Children's laughter, bright and unguarded in a way rarely heard within these solemn walls. Drawn by the sound, he paused, careful to remain unseen in the shadowed hallway. Alara sat on a simple wooden stool, her daughters gathered around her as she told them a story, her hands animated in the flickering candlelight. The eldest girl mimicked a warrior's stance, making her sisters giggle. The middle child corrected some detail of the tale, serious and precise even in play. And the youngest, perched on her mother's lap, watched with wide eyes that seemed to absorb every word, every gesture, storing them like treasures. For the first time in years, he felt a warmth that had nothing to do with duty or politics or the burden of his birthright. The weight of solitude that had corroded him since childhood seemed to dissipate, if only for a moment. Here was something real, a family bound by love rather than obligation, finding joy even amid danger and uncertainty. But alongside this unexpected warmth came a dilemma that grew more acute with each passing day. To protect this new family or to obey the crown? To follow his instincts or to yield to the machinery of power that had shaped his entire existence? The choice tore at him, a battle between the prince he had been raised to be and the man he perhaps wanted to become. In the midst of this turmoil, a loyal servant, a weathered man who had once been his childhood guard, brought him information that chilled his blood. There were whispers in the servants' quarters, quickly silenced when anyone of rank approached, about plans to ensure the peasant woman would disappear without leaving traces. "They speak of an accident, my lord," the servant reported, his voice barely above a whisper, though they stood in the prince's private chambers. "A fall from the ramparts, perhaps, or a sudden illness. Something that would raise no questions, require no investigation." "Who?" the prince demanded, his hand instinctively moving to the hilt of the ceremonial dagger at his waist. "Who plans this?" The servant's eyes darted nervously to the heavy tapestries that lined the walls, as if assassins might lurk behind each one. "I could not discover the source, my lord. The whispers come from many mouths, but the original voice remains hidden." The prince felt ice spreading through his veins. If he did not act quickly, he could lose her forever. This woman whose courage had awakened something in him, whose children carried a truth that could either destroy or transform the kingdom. As dawn broke over the castle battlements, painting the stone walls with pale gold light, the prince made his decision. He would no longer be reactive, responding to threats as they emerged. He would seize control of this narrative, uncover the full truth, and then, only then, determine the right course of action. But first, he needed to ensure Alara's safety. Moving her and the children to more secure chambers, closer to his own royal apartments, would buy time and demonstrate his continued commitment to their protection. It would also send a clear message to those plotting in shadows. These lives were under royal protection, and to threaten them was to challenge the prince himself. The die was cast. There would be no turning back from the path he had chosen, no retreat to the comfortable isolation that had defined his existence. For better or worse, his fate was now intertwined with that of a peasant woman and her 3 mysterious daughters. The prince decided to act, and in the dead of night, led the peasant woman through the sleeping castle. Torches burned low in their sconces, casting elongated shadows that danced across stone walls as they moved silently through corridors few ever traversed. Alara followed close behind, her footsteps nearly soundless, a skill honed from years of avoiding notice, first as a servant, then as an outcast. "Where are the children?" she whispered, anxiety tightening her throat. "Safe," the prince assured her. "My most trusted guard watches over them. No one will disturb their sleep." He didn't add that the guard was under orders to defend the girls with his life if necessary. Such words would only heighten the fear he already saw in her eyes. They descended a narrow spiral staircase, the steps worn smooth by centuries of use. The air grew cooler, tinged with the scent of old parchment and forgotten secrets. Alara suppressed a shiver, wrapping her borrowed shawl more tightly around her shoulders. The castle had seemed immense above ground, but these hidden passages beneath revealed its true vastness, a stone labyrinth of history and hidden purpose. After what seemed an eternity of twisting corridors and unmarked doors, the prince stopped before a heavy oak panel reinforced with iron bands. From within his tunic, he withdrew a key so ancient its original shape had been smoothed by generations of hands. The lock yielded with a reluctant groan, and the door swung inward to reveal a chamber untouched by time. "The Royal Archives," he explained, lifting a waiting lantern to illuminate rows of shelves laden with scrolls, leather-bound volumes, and wooden boxes filled with documents. "The true history of the kingdom rests here, unaltered by the convenient revisions favored by court historians." Dust motes danced in the lantern light as they moved deeper into the room. Alara's eyes widened at the wealth of knowledge surrounding them. She who had never learned to read more than the simplest market signs, now standing amidst the accumulated wisdom of centuries. The prince moved with purpose toward a section marked by the royal crest. His fingers traced the spines of several volumes before selecting one bound in faded red leather. "The birth records," he explained. laying the heavy tome on a reading table worn smooth by countless elbows. Every royal birth for the past 200 years is documented here, including any distinguishing marks or traits. Carefully, reverently, he opened the volume to pages near its middle. The parchment crackled softly, the ink still dark despite its age. His finger moved down columns of elegant script until it stopped at a particular entry. "Here," he said, voice barely above a whisper, "the birth of my uncle, the king's older brother." Alara leaned forward, unable to read the words but drawn by the prince's intensity. In the margin beside the entry was a small illustration, a perfect crescent moon, identical to the marks her daughters bore on their wrists. "In my family," the prince explained, "this birthmark appears only in those of direct royal lineage. It skips some generations entirely, then reappears without warning. My uncle bore it. I bear it." He turned to face her fully, his expression grave in the flickering light. "And your daughters bear it as well." The implications hung in the air between them, too momentous to be immediately grasped. Alara's hand moved to her throat, fingers pressing against her pulse as if to steady its sudden racing. "What does this mean?" she asked, though part of her already knew, had known perhaps, since that terrible night when a nobleman with cold eyes and a crescent mark on his wrist had commanded her to his chambers. The prince closed the book gently, then led her to another section of the archives. Here the documents were newer, the ink barely dried by time. From a cedar chest, he withdrew a scroll bearing the royal seal and unrolled it carefully on the table. "The official account of my uncle's death," he said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "A hero's death in battle, or so the kingdom was told." His finger traced the lines of the report, the border skirmish, the ambush, the recovery of bloodied garments and a broken sword. "But there was no body," he continued, "no witnesses to his final moments. Only convenient evidence delivered by men whose loyalty was purchased rather than earned." Alara's eyes widened as understanding dawned. "You believe he lives?" "I believe nothing was as it seemed," the prince replied. "My uncle was cruel, Alara. Cruel in ways that were whispered about but never addressed. The court turned blind eyes to his appetites. His visits to villages during hunting expeditions became notorious among those who served him, though none dared speak openly. He faced the peasant woman and said in a low voice, "Your daughters carry the blood of the royal family. They are not a source of shame. They are heirs." The words hung in the still air of the archives, weighty with implication. Revealing such a truth would challenge the very foundations of the kingdom's power structure, threatening those who had constructed careful lies to maintain their positions. Alara sank onto a wooden chair, her legs suddenly unable to support her. Tears welled in her eyes, not tears of joy at this revelation, but tears of terror. "Then they are in even greater danger than I feared," she whispered, her voice breaking. "If what you say is true, there are those who would rather see my children dead than acknowledge their birthright." The prince knelt before her, taking her rough, work-worn hands in his own. "I will not allow that to happen," he promised. The formal distance of prince and peasant momentarily forgotten in the face of this shared understanding. "But we must be careful. To challenge the official account of my uncle's fate is to question decisions made at the highest levels of power. The kingdom has been built on certain truths or convenient lies that many would kill to protect." Alara's tears fell freely now, landing on their clasped hands. "I never wanted this," she confessed. "I only wanted my daughters to live without shame, without hunger. I never sought power or position or revenge." "I believe you," the prince said softly, "and that is why I must protect you, all of you. Because your daughter's existence represents not just a scandal to be buried, but a truth that perhaps the kingdom needs to face." But before they could continue their conversation, footsteps echoed in the corridor outside. They froze, hands still clasped, as the steps drew nearer. The prince extinguished the lantern with a swift movement, plunging them into darkness broken only by the faint glow that seeped beneath the door. "No one should know of this place," he whispered, his breath warm against Alara's ear. "No one but the royal family and the master of archives, who has been dead these 3 months with no replacement yet appointed." The footsteps stopped just outside. A shadow blocked the thin line of light beneath the door. The prince's hand moved silently to the dagger at his belt, while Alara pressed herself against the shelves, trying to become one with the shadows. The door handle turned slowly, the ancient mechanism moving with deliberate care. As the door began to swing inward, the prince tensed, ready to defend their discovery and their lives if necessary. A tall figure stood silhouetted against the dim light of the corridor. "I thought I might find you here, Your Highness," said a voice that the prince recognized immediately, a voice that sent ice through his veins despite its seemingly calm tone. The figure stepped forward, and the face of the king's most trusted advisor emerged from shadow. His thin lips curved in what might have been a smile on another man, but on him resembled nothing so much as a predator's assessment of potential prey. "I see you've been conducting some research of your own," the advisor continued, his gaze moving from the prince to Alara, then to the open birth records still laid out on the table. "How industrious of you." The prince straightened, placing himself between Alara and the newcomer. "What brings you to the archives at this hour, Lord Donovan?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral despite the tension coiling within him. The advisor's smile deepened, revealing teeth too perfect to be trusted. "The same curiosity that brought you, I imagine. The past has a way of demanding attention, especially when it threatens to collide with the present in such interesting ways." His gaze shifted to Alara, who stood frozen in fear and defiance. "I already know what you've discovered," he said softly, the words falling into the dusty silence like stones into still water. The man who had emerged from the shadows was Lord Donovan, a royal advisor known throughout the kingdom for his razor-sharp mind and questionable loyalties. His silver-streaked hair was immaculately groomed even at this late hour, his clothing free of even the smallest wrinkle, a man for whom appearance was another form of power. In the dim light of the archives, his eyes glinted like polished obsidian, revealing nothing while seeing everything. "My dear prince," he said, his voice silky with practiced charm as he closed the heavy door behind him. "You've gone to such lengths to uncover a truth that some of us have guarded for years." He moved further into the room with the silent grace of a predator, his gaze sweeping over the open books and scattered documents. "How very commendable of you." The prince maintained his position between Alara and the advisor, one hand still resting on the hilt of his dagger. "If you've known all along, Lord Donovan, then you've been complicit in a grave injustice." A soft, humorless laugh escaped the older man's lips. "Injustice? Is that what we're calling political necessity these days?" He picked up a scroll, examining its seal before setting it down with deliberate care. "Your uncle's proclivities were becoming problematic. His appetites for power, for pleasure, for cruelty threatened the stability of the realm. Surely even you can understand the difficult choices required to maintain order." "You speak of murder as if it were merely an unpleasant duty," the prince replied, disgust evident in his tone. Donovan's smile widened, displaying teeth too perfect to be natural. "Murder? Who said anything about murder? Your uncle lives, or at least he did when last I received reports. Exile suited our purposes far better than martyrdom. The hero's death was simply convenient fiction." This revelation landed like a physical blow. The prince had suspected deception, but not this elaborate charade. "He lives," he repeated, the words hollow with disbelief. "In the eastern provinces, stripped of title and identity but quite alive," Donovan confirmed with a dismissive wave of his hand. "Though I'm told his temperament has not improved with circumstance." Alara, who had remained silent until now, stepped forward despite the prince's protective stance. "Then he could return," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He could claim his daughters." Donovan's gaze shifted to her, assessing her with cold calculation. "Ah, the mother speaks. How touching." His smile turned malicious. "Yes, theoretically he could return. He could reclaim what he considers his property, the throne, the power, the children." "Is that what you want, peasant woman? To see your daughters in the hands of a man who thought so little of you, that he didn't even bother to learn your name before he took what he wanted?" Alara flinched as if struck, but stood her ground. "I want my daughters safe, nothing more." "Safety?" Donovan mused, circling the table to stand directly across from them. Such a relative concept, particularly in a royal court. Tell me, Prince, what did you hope to accomplish with this discovery? To restore your uncle to his rightful place? To claim the children as legitimate heirs? To rewrite history according to your own sense of justice? Each question was delivered like the twist of a knife, designed to probe for weakness. The prince met the advisor's gaze steadily. I sought the truth. What happens next depends on whether that truth serves justice or merely power. A prince concerned with justice rather than power, Donovan said with mock wonder. How refreshingly idealistic. His expression hardened. And how dangerously naive. With fluid grace, he withdrew a folded document from within his robes and placed it on the table between them. A secret like this is worth more than gold, more than a life, he said, letting the silence hang heavy after his words. Many lives, potentially. The prince didn't reach for the document. Is this a threat, Lord Donovan? Merely an observation, the advisor replied smoothly. Secrets of this magnitude have consequences, regardless of intention. The question is who controls those consequences. He gestured to the document. Inside, you'll find two possible futures carefully outlined. In one, you continue your crusade for truth. The peasant woman's origins become public knowledge, her daughters recognized as bearing royal blood, illegitimate of course, but royal nonetheless. The court fractures along lines of loyalty. The king's authority is questioned. Neighboring kingdoms sense weakness and press their advantages, and in the ensuing chaos, 3 little girls become targets for every ambitious power in the realm. His voice remained calm, as if discussing nothing more consequential than the weather. In the other future, you return the woman and her children to a comfortable obscurity, a country estate perhaps, with servants and security, far from court intrigue. You resume your duties as prince, including a politically advantageous marriage to Princess Isolde, securing our southern border against aggression. The kingdom prospers. Peace endures. He spread his hands. The choice seems rather obvious to those of us concerned with the greater good. The prince's jaw tightened. You speak of the greater good while engineering a convenient lie. All governance is built on convenient lies, Donovan countered. The divine right of kings. The nobility of noble blood. The justice of conquest. Would you tear down these foundations and watch the kingdom collapse around you, all for the sake of 3 peasant girls? The prince started to respond, but Alara stepped fully forward, her face composed, despite the fear that surely coursed through her. They are not just any girls, she said, her common accent stark against Donovan's cultured tones. They are children with the blood of kings, whether acknowledged or not. And they deserve better than to be bargaining pieces in your political games. Donovan's eyebrows rose slightly, genuine surprise flickering across his features before his mask of control returned. Well spoken, for a village woman, he conceded. But sentiment changes nothing. The world is as it is, not as we might wish it to be. He turned his attention back to the prince. You have until dawn to decide. Either abandon this foolish quest for truth, or I will be forced to implement contingency plans. The prince tried to negotiate, offering compromises that would protect both the children and the kingdom's stability, but Donovan remained unmoved. Your choices are as I've presented them, he insisted. The welfare of many against the principle of a few. The pragmatic against the idealistic. Choose wisely, Your Highness. With that, he turned to leave, his robes sweeping the stone floor with a whisper of expensive fabric. At the door, he paused, looking back over his shoulder. Oh, and should you be considering any rash actions, remember that your movements are being observed. The safety of the peasants' daughters depends entirely on your cooperation. The heavy door closed behind him with a sound of finality, leaving the prince and Alara in stunned silence. The dilemma tore at the prince's soul. Choose the love and truth he had only just discovered, or save the kingdom from a scandal that could destroy everything. The weight of the choice pressed down upon him like a physical force. He had been raised to put duty above all else, to sacrifice personal desires for the good of the realm. Yet something in him rebelled against surrendering to Donovan's manipulations, against allowing fear to dictate justice. He turned to Alara, whose face reflected his own internal battle. "What would you have me do?" he asked, for perhaps the first time in his life seeking guidance rather than giving commands. Before she could answer, a small figure appeared from behind a row of shelves. The middle daughter, her eyes wide with understanding beyond her years. She must have followed them, moving through the castle with the silent skill she had developed for survival. "Don't leave us," she whispered, grasping the prince's arm with surprising strength. In that innocent plea lay all the complexity of his choice: duty against compassion, pragmatism against principle, the weight of a crown against the trust of a child. Donovan, watching from a hidden observation point built into the very walls of the archive, smiled coldly at the scene. "There is your weakness exposed," he murmured to himself, already calculating how best to use this emotional leverage. Not ambition, not power, but simple human connection. How predictably disappointing. The game had entered its final moves, with pieces positioned for maximum advantage. By morning, the future of the kingdom would be decided, not on a battlefield or in a throne room, but in the secret conflict between truth and expedience, between the heart of a solitary prince and the cold calculations of those who truly wielded power. The prince spent the remaining hours of darkness in solitary deliberation, pacing the length of his chambers as the moon traced its slow arc across the night sky. By the time the first pale fingers of dawn stretched across the eastern horizon, he had made his decision. Not the easy choice, nor perhaps the wise one by the standards of court politics, but the only choice his conscience would allow. He summoned his most trusted guards, men whose loyalty was to him personally rather than to the crown or its advisors. "Bring the woman and her daughters to my private audience chamber," he instructed. "Ensure they are not seen and that no harm comes to them." The captain of his guard, a weathered veteran with a face lined by battles both seen and unseen, nodded once, understanding the gravity of the command without requiring explanation. As the castle stirred to wakefulness, the prince made his way to the great hall where morning court would soon convene. Nobles and officials already gathered in small clusters, their conversations falling silent as he passed. News of his unusual interest in a peasant family had spread throughout the court, generating speculation that ranged from the merely scandalous to the potentially treasonous. He took his position at the right hand of the throne, standing tall despite the weight of sleeplessness. The king would not attend today. A convenient illness kept him to his chambers more often than not these days, leaving the daily business of the realm to his son and the royal advisors. The Queen Mother, however, was present, her regal posture and calculating gaze missing nothing as courtiers took their accustomed places. Lord Donovan arrived precisely on time, as was his habit. Their eyes met across the crowded hall, an unspoken question in the advisor's gaze. The prince gave nothing away, his expression carefully neutral as he nodded toward the master of ceremonies to begin the day's proceedings. Routine matters of state occupied the first hour: land disputes between minor nobles, reports from provincial governors, petitions from merchant guilds. The prince participated as expected, offering judgments and suggestions with the measured wisdom that had earned him respect even from those who found him too reserved for proper courtly life. Then, as the last petitioner withdrew, the prince stepped forward. A hush fell over the assembly, sensing that something unprecedented was about to occur. "I wish to address a matter of grave importance to the realm," he announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the vast hall. "A matter concerning justice, truth, and the very foundations upon which our kingdom stands." At a gesture from the prince, the doors opened to reveal Alara and her 3 daughters, escorted by his personal guards. The peasant woman had been provided with clean, simple clothing, not the finery of nobility, but neither the rags of destitution. She walked with her head high, maternal instinct overcoming fear, as she guided her children into the heart of power that had so often been the source of her suffering. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the assembly. Lady Beatrice, a particular favorite of the Queen Mother, pressed a scented handkerchief to her nose, as if the very presence of commoners might contaminate the air. Lord Kearney's hand moved instinctively to his sword hilt, though he did not draw the weapon. and Lord Donovan's face darkened with barely contained fury as he realized the prince had chosen defiance over compliance. "This woman," the prince continued, indicating Alara with a respectful gesture, "and her children have been subjected to cruelty and injustice that cannot stand unchallenged. For they are not merely peasants deserving of our basic charity. They are descendants of royal blood that this court has attempted to erase from memory and record." The murmuring grew louder, faces turning from confusion to shock as understanding dawned. The Queen Mother rose from her seat, her expression unreadable, but her posture rigid with tension. "The children you see before you bear the crescent birthmark of the royal line," the prince declared, gesturing for the eldest girl to step forward and display her wrist. "The same mark I bear, the same mark borne by my uncle, Lord Alaric, before his supposed death in battle 5 years ago." The hall erupted in chaos. Nobles shouted questions and denials. Guards looked to their commanders for orders, uncertain where their duty lay in this unprecedented situation. The Queen Mother remained standing, silent amidst the tumult, her gaze fixed on the 3 small girls who threatened decades of careful planning and political maneuvering. The king, informed of the commotion, entered unexpectedly from a side door. Though frail and leaning heavily on a carved walking staff, his presence commanded immediate attention. The shouting subsided as he made his way slowly to the throne, eyes narrowed as he surveyed the scene before him. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, his voice weaker than in years past but still carrying the authority of the crown. The prince turned to face his father, respect in his posture but determination in his eyes. "Father, I have discovered a truth that has been hidden from you, from all of us. Your brother did not die in battle as we were told. He was exiled in secret, his death fabricated to prevent scandal. And these children bear his bloodline, cast out and abused for a circumstance of birth they could not control." The king's face flushed with anger. "This is absurd. Who dares to invent such tales?" His gaze swept the hall, landing finally on Alara and her daughters. For a moment, something flickered in his eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or memory of a brother whose cruelties he had too often overlooked. "Seize him," the king commanded, pointing a trembling finger at his son. "He speaks treason against the crown." Guards moved forward reluctantly, torn between their oath to the king and their loyalty to the prince who had always treated them with fairness and respect. The moment balanced on a knife's edge. One wrong move could plunge the court into violence that would echo throughout the kingdom. It was then that the Queen Mother stepped forward, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade through silk. "Stop," she commanded. And such was her authority, cultivated through decades of political survival, that everyone, guards, nobles, even the king, obeyed. With the grace that had made her legendary in her youth, she descended from the dais to stand before Alara and her children. For a long moment, she simply looked at them, her expression revealing nothing of her thoughts. Then she turned to face the assembled court. "The true shame," she declared, her voice firm and carrying to every corner of the hall, "is not in the birth of these children, but in the silence we have carried all these years. We cannot continue lying to ourselves." The hall, stunned by this unexpected intervention, fell completely silent. The Queen Mother, who had been the embodiment of royal protocol for as long as most could remember, was publicly acknowledging a scandal that threatened the very legitimacy of the throne. "My son speaks truth," she continued, her gaze sweeping across the nobles and officials who had served her family for generations. "My husband's brother was indeed exiled, not killed. His cruelties, particularly toward women, had become too numerous to ignore, too dangerous to the stability of the realm." She turned to look directly at Lord Donovan, whose face had lost all color. "Some advised execution, but we chose mercy, or perhaps cowardice, sending him to the eastern provinces with a new identity and explicit instructions never to return." The king slumped in his throne, the facade of righteous anger crumbling into something closer to defeat. "Helena," he said softly, using the queen's given name for perhaps the first time in public memory. "Why now? After all these years of silence?" "Because silence has its own cost," she replied, her voice softening as she looked at the three girls who stood bewildered at the center of this royal drama. "Look at them, husband. Really look. They bear his blood, but also yours. They are innocent of his sins, yet have suffered for them nonetheless." The prince, watching his mother with newfound respect, stepped forward to stand beside her. "The truth cannot remain buried forever," he said, "nor should it. These children deserve acknowledgement of their heritage and protection from those who would harm them for it." The king looked from his wife to his son, then to the peasant woman and her daughters. For the first time, he truly saw them, not as an inconvenience to be removed, but as living consequences of choices made long ago. The eldest girl met his gaze without flinching, the same stubborn pride evident in her bearing that had characterized his brother in youth, before power corrupted it into cruelty. The village, upon learning the truth, divided itself between scandal and hope. Some recoiled from the revelation, clinging to comfortable hierarchies that placed royalty above common folk in a divinely ordained order. Others saw possibility in this disruption of the established order. If a peasant's daughters could be acknowledged as carrying royal blood, perhaps other barriers might also fall. But for the prince, walking through the castle courtyard with Alara and her daughters in the days that followed, these larger implications mattered less than the simple truth that, finally, he was not alone. The solitude that had been his constant companion since childhood had been replaced by something new, a family bound not by formal obligation, but by choice and shared adversity. And in the tears that flowed down each face, the king's as he formally acknowledged his nieces before the court, the queen's as she placed protective hands on small shoulders, the prince's as he watched a new future unfold, there was a profound lesson. True nobility did not reside in the blood one hid, but in the courage to live in truth, no matter the cost. True nobility isn't found in bloodlines or crowns, but in the courage to stand for truth when lies would be easier. In this tale of a prince who chose compassion over convenience, we witness how a single act of kindness can unravel the carefully constructed falsehoods that power so often builds around itself. What would you risk to protect the innocent? Would you have the strength to challenge an entire kingdom's beliefs for the sake of justice? Perhaps the most profound truth revealed is that family isn't always defined by birth, but sometimes by choice, by recognizing ourselves in others when the rest of the world turns away. The prince found his freedom from loneliness not in royal privilege, but in defending those whom society had cast aside. His story reminds us that our greatest legacy may not be the titles we hold, but the lives we change when we choose courage over fear, truth over comfort. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs to be reminded that sometimes the most royal thing we can do is extend our hand to those in the dust. Subscribe to hear more tales that challenge us to look beyond appearances and find the deeper truths that connect us all. After all, every one of us carries something royal within, the capacity to choose compassion when the world chooses cruelty.